What do you really know about vampires? Hollywood fantasies? Dime store novels? All of it is a lie. A beautiful wrapper concealing a terrifying, inconvenient, and absolutely true reality. What if I told you that one of Europe's most powerful governments in the 18th century officially hunted the dead? And I have the proof. Today, we're going to crack open classified archives, and you'll see with your own eyes protocols written in blood and fear, where military doctors meticulously documented the reanimated dead with scientific precision. Who truly stood behind the image of Count Dracula? Do you think it's just a legend? But what if it was the very first information war in human history? A dirty political game where a real prince was deliberately transformed into a monster to conceal shocking secrets that remain unspoken to this day. Why did entire villages descend into madness, digging up the graves of their loved ones? Was it a mass hysteria? Or was it a cold, cynical calculation, where accusations of vampirism served as the perfect cover for a power grab and brutal redistribution of wealth? I promise you, this isn't just another spooky story for bedtime. This is a global investigation that will follow the bloody trail of humanity's most ancient myth and reveal how it still controls us even today in the 21st century. Watch this video until the very end, and you'll understand that the real monster wasn't hiding in a coffin all along. It's almost axiomatic. Vampires are pure fiction, characters from Gothic novels and Hollywood blockbusters. But here's a paradoxical and absolutely documented fact that shatters that notion. In 1732, at the height of the Enlightenment, a time when Europe championed science and reason, the government of the powerful Austrian Empire dispatched an official military medical commission to a Serbian village. Their purpose wasn't to investigate a murder or a rebellion. Their mission was to exhume bodies to determine if the deceased had become vampires. The commission, led by regimental surgeon Johann Fluckinger, opened graves, drafted protocols, and sent a meticulously detailed report to Vienna about undecomposed bodies with traces of fresh blood on their lips. This wasn't folklore. This was a bureaucratic document from one of the greatest powers of that era. This means our story won't just be a collection of scary tales or an analysis of another horror film. Instead, it will be a sweeping historical investigation, almost a detective story. We'll attempt to understand why the belief in blood-drinking entities proved so pervasive and tenacious that it compelled rational military doctors and officials of the 18th century to seriously engage in hunting the dead. It's an epic drama about how profound human fears of illness, death, and the unknown forged one of the most powerful monsters in the history of world culture. A monster that turned out to be more real than we're accustomed to believing. And what strikes me most about all this isn't the mere existence of superstitions, but their astonishing universality and resilience. The idea of a dead person returning to feed on the life force of the living emerges independently in dozens of cultures separated by millennia and oceans. Sumerian demons, Greek lamias, Slavic vurdalaks, Romanian strigoi, they all tell the same story, just in different languages. This myth has proven to be an incredibly tenacious cultural virus, mutating and adapting to every new epoch, from ancient rituals to contemporary urban legends. That is where its true power lies. Let's leave our 21st century behind for a moment and transport ourselves to the world where these fears were born. Imagine an Eastern European village in the 17th or 18th century. The air here is thick and layered. By day, it's a familiar blend of scents: damp earth, smoke from chimneys, the tangy aroma of the farmyard, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. But with the onset of dusk, everything shifts. The air grows heavy with tension, carrying new notes. The pungent scent of garlic hung by windows and doors, and the subtle, almost imperceptible aroma of incense from a house where someone has recently died. And the sounds, too, are different. The daytime bustle gives way to a tense silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards, the anxious bark of a distant dog, or the wind's howl, which seems to carry someone's hungry moan. This isn't just a village, it's a world governed by different laws. At night, in the dim flicker of a rushlight, shadows on the walls seem alive and malevolent. Every rustle outside the window isn't just a branch, but a potential step of the dead. A cold draught creeping under the door is the icy breath from a grave. In this world, there are no accidental deaths or unexplained illnesses. If someone begins to waste away, grow pale, and lose strength, if strange marks appear on their neck, and if nightmares plague them nightly, for people of that era, the diagnosis was undeniable. It wasn't tuberculosis or anemia, it was the work of a vampire. And the most terrifying part was that this vampire wasn't a stranger, but a former neighbor, relative, or friend. To grasp the logic of these people, we must understand two key codes of their culture. The first and foremost is the concept of the unquiet dead. In the Slavic worldview, this wasn't merely someone who had passed, but an individual who had died an improper, unclean death. Suicides, drunkards, sorcerers, unbaptized infants, or victims of violence, all of them couldn't find peace in the afterlife. It was believed that Mother Damp Earth wouldn't accept them, condemning them to wander between worlds, envying the living and seeking to drain their life force. Such a deceased wasn't merely a spirit, they were a tangible threat, capable of rising from the grave and returning to their former home. The second code is the absolute permeability of the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. For us, this boundary is an impassable wall. For them, it was a thin veil which, at certain moments or in specific places, thinned and became permeable. A graveyard wasn't just a burial ground, it was a portal. Night wasn't merely a time of day, but when the other side seeped into this one. Any epidemic, any livestock blight, or any crop failure wasn't seen as a chain of natural events, but as a direct invasion of hostile forces from beyond that veil. And someone had to have opened the passage for them. That someone was precisely the unquiet dead. And this is where we arrive at the most precise and compelling analogy from our own world. The entire complex of beliefs and rituals associated with vampires was, in essence, a spiritual and public health protocol for a pre-scientific era. Imagine an inexplicable illness as a computer virus attacking a village network. The villagers didn't know about microbes, but they saw the result. People shutting down one by one. Their antivirus program was the centuries-old wisdom of their ancestors. Scanning the system meant searching for the root cause, which invariably turned out to be a recently deceased, unquiet dead. And deleting the virus was that very terrifying ritual, opening the grave, impaling the body with an aspen stake, and burning it. This wasn't an act of vandalism. It was a desperate attempt to reboot the system and restore the disrupted order of the cosmos. Thus, the fear of vampires wasn't just blind superstition, it was an integral, albeit foreign to our modern sensibilities, part of a holistic worldview. Within this framework, humanity wasn't the master of nature, but a tiny component of a vast, living cosmos, teeming with unseen forces that demanded reverence and strict adherence to their rules. Violating these rules, especially in a matter as profound as death, led to catastrophic consequences. And the vampire was the most vivid and terrifying embodiment of this disaster. The tipping point, the very catalyst that transformed localized superstitions into a pan-European panic, was a specific historical moment and a specific place. The early 18th century, along the border between the Austrian and Ottoman empires. This was a land steeped in blood and fear. Territories recently wrested from the Ottomans, like Serbia, were zones of instability where military garrisons coexisted with villages that lived by ancestral laws. Here, real epidemics, brought by war and poor hygiene, overlaid ancient myths, creating a perfect breeding ground for the birth of a true monster. And it didn't take long to emerge. The engine of this story wasn't a single person, but one specific incident that snowballed to incredible proportions. This is the tale of a Serbian peasant named Arnold Paule. In 1726, he returned to his village of Medveđa from army service, where, by his own account, he had been attacked by a vampire. He claimed to have dealt with the threat, but soon after his return, he died in an accident. A few weeks after his burial, a string of mysterious deaths began in the village. People died one after another from an inexplicable illness that seemed to drain the very life from them. For the villagers, the answer was obvious. Arnold Paule had returned. And it was at this point that a truly revolutionary and incredibly audacious concept for its time emerged, one that transformed a common ghoul into a continental threat. The peasants concluded that Paule wasn't merely killing, he was creating others like himself. Each of his victims, having ingested infected blood, would themselves become vampires after death. This was no longer a solitary revenant haunting its own family. This was an epidemic, a supernatural plague that spread with mathematical precision, threatening to wipe out the entire village and then, perhaps, the entire world. The idea of the vampire as a carrier of infection, as a patient zero, that was the true engine of this unfolding narrative. The contemporary reaction was predictable and decisive. Following centuries-old protocol, the villagers opened Arnold Paule's grave. According to the official report, which would later land on the desks of Austrian officials, his body was undecomposed. Fresh blood flowed from his eyes, nose, and ears, and his nails and hair continued to grow. Upon witnessing this incontrovertible evidence, they pierced his heart with an aspen stake, after which, as the report states, the corpse emitted a loud groan. The body was then decapitated and burned. The same was done with the bodies of his presumed victims. It seemed the threat had passed. But 5 years later, in 1731, the epidemic returned with a vengeance. People who seemingly had no direct connection to Paule began to die. And this sent shockwaves through the region. It became agonizingly clear that the ancient rituals hadn't worked. The virus hadn't been destroyed. It had simply lay dormant. Panic swept not only through the village but across the entire region. Local Austrian authorities, comprised of pragmatic military officers, could no longer dismiss everything as mere peasant superstition. The deaths were real. The fear was real. And it threatened stability along the empire's strategically vital border. No one in enlightened Vienna had anticipated such dispatches from their officers. Reports of vampires, written in officialese on government letterhead, read like the ravings of a madman. Yet they kept coming. The panic was so immense that it could no longer be ignored. The authorities had to respond to the threat, even if they didn't believe in it. It was then that the unprecedented decision was made to send that very official military medical commission led by Surgeon Johann Fluckinger to Medveđa. Thus, thanks to the story of Arnold Paule, a humble Balkan folklore character underwent an astonishing transformation. He ceased to be a mere village bogeyman. He became the subject of a state investigation, fodder for newspaper headlines across Europe, and the topic of heated debates in Parisian salons. The vampire was reborn, not as a myth, but as a documented phenomenon that demanded an explanation. And all of Europe held its breath, waiting to see what the imperial doctors would discover in those cursed Serbian graves. To grasp how belief in vampires could paralyze entire regions, we must abandon the notion that it was mere chaotic hysteria. In reality, a vampire hunt wasn't some frenzied act of mob justice. It was a rigorous, almost legal process, a perfectly calibrated social mechanism, a kind of posthumous trial. And as our central metaphor, we'll examine it precisely as such. An emergency response protocol with its own distinct stages, its own internal logic, and its own irrefutable evidence, at least from the perspective of people in that era. This wasn't magic. It was a chillingly effective technology for managing fear. Let's peer under the hood of this machine, with the keen curiosity of an engineer studying an unfamiliar but ingeniously designed apparatus. It all begins not with shouts and pitchforks, but with a quiet, creeping dread. In the village, people start dying, one after another. At first, this is attributed to God's will or a lean year. But when deaths become a series and the sick exhibit similar symptoms, paleness, weakness, nighttime suffocation, the first phase of the protocol kicks in, the hunt for patient zero. The community's memory sifts through recent deaths, and suspicion almost always falls upon the unquiet dead, those who died suddenly, violently, or without repentance. This constitutes a posthumous indictment. Now, let's visualize the process. Step 1. Gathering evidence and obtaining sanction to proceed. An informal investigation begins. Neighbors share troubling dreams in which the deceased appeared to them. Relatives of the sick recall hearing footsteps outside the house or a tapping at the window. Someone discovers strange bruises on a sick person's body. These disparate facts coalesce into a compelling case against the deceased. Once a critical mass of rumors and fears is reached, the community appeals to an elder or priest, or in the case of the Austrian Empire, to the local authority. Upon receiving permission, they move to the next step. This is no longer vigilantism, it is a legitimate procedure. Step 2. Exhumation, or the investigative experiment. This is the culmination of the entire process. A group of chosen men, typically the bravest and most respected, and sometimes even relatives of the deceased, armed with shovels, religious icons, and the primary tool, an aspen stake, makes its way to the graveyard. A tense, ritualistic silence descends. They unearth the grave. And this is where it gets truly fascinating, because they aren't looking for a fanged monster. They are searching for a very specific set of signs that to them constitute incontrovertible evidence. And here they are, these clues. Let's dissect them from a modern scientific perspective. First, the body hasn't decomposed. To them, this was a clear sign of unholy forces. To us, it's the result of natural processes: cold, clay-rich soil, lack of oxygen, or the process of saponification, where body fats transform into a wax-like substance, preserving the remains. Second, traces of fresh blood on the lips and inside the coffin. To them, proof of nighttime predation. To us, the result of putrefaction of internal organs, where gases force fluid remnants out through the mouth and nose. Third, grown hair and nails. Again, no mysticism here. This is merely an illusion created by the drying and tightening of the skin. Finally, the most chilling piece of evidence. When the body is pierced with a stake, it might emit a groan. To them, the death wail of the unholy creature. To us, the sound of decomposition gases escaping the lungs under pressure. Step 3. Carrying out the verdict. Once the evidence was laid bare, the guilty verdict became undeniable to everyone present. And so began the final act of ritualistic destruction. An aspen stake. Aspen was considered a sacred tree capable of subduing unholy forces, was driven with a single powerful blow into the heart of the deceased. Sometimes the body was decapitated to definitively strip it of any ability to move. And the most foolproof method was believed to be the complete cremation of the body on a pyre, after which the ashes were scattered to the wind or buried. This wasn't merely the killing of a dead person, it was an act of total purification, erasing the very memory of them from the world of the living. Thus, this entire gruesome procedure was not a display of savagery, but a form of social control and collective psychotherapy. This trial of the dead gave people the illusion of power over chaos. It didn't cure tuberculosis, but it did cure panic. It transformed the abstract, unconquerable fear of an epidemic into a concrete material enemy that could be found, condemned, and destroyed according to a clearly defined protocol. From an engineering standpoint, this mechanism was flawless. It always yielded results because its goal wasn't to stop a disease, but to restore order in people's minds. We talk a lot about vampires, but let's shift our focus for a moment to those who lived with this fear every single day. Here's a tangible, almost statistical fact that helps us grasp the full depth of the tragedy. For an ordinary peasant in 18th century Serbia or Wallachia, the likelihood of personally participating in the exhumation of a neighbor's corpse was higher than the likelihood of seeing a licensed doctor in their entire lifetime. Medicine was a privilege of cities and aristocracy, while fighting an invisible threat that wiped out entire families was a harsh and dirty job that had to be done with one's own hands. This wasn't a hunt for glory or adrenaline. This was a desperate public health measure, an obligation for every community member in the face of an existential threat. And behind the scenes of this grim drama always stood two unsung but crucial figures, without whom this entire mechanism simply wouldn't have worked. First, there was the local priest or village elder. He wasn't a hunter, he was a judge and a psychologist. The burden of making the most terrifying decision to permit the opening of a grave rested on his shoulders. This was a tremendous moral compromise. On one hand, disturbing the rest of the deceased was a terrible sin. On the other, inaction in the face of an epidemic, claiming the lives of his parishioners, was an even greater sin. He listened to frightened people, analyzed rumors, assessed the scale of the panic, and ultimately, through his authority, legitimized what in any other situation would have been considered sacrilege and vandalism. His word transformed a panicked crowd into executors of a necessary ritual. The second, and perhaps even more vital hero, was the cunning man, or, as he was called, the witch doctor. This individual was a living encyclopedia of the supernatural. He held no formal power, but possessed knowledge, that practical experience passed down through generations. He knew how to distinguish a proper corpse from an improper one. He knew precisely that the stake had to be made of aspen, not oak. He remembered the correct incantations and prayers to recite during the exhumation. He was the technical specialist, the chief engineer of this gruesome procedure. While the priest provided spiritual permission, the cunning man ensured the technical execution of the ritual, without which the entire operation would have been considered ineffective and even dangerous to the participants themselves. It was precisely these individuals, the elder, the priest, the cunning man, who formed the invisible framework that kept society from complete collapse in times of mass panic. They weren't heroes in our modern sense. They were crisis managers operating within the paradigm of their time. Their decisions were harsh, their methods barbaric, but they gave people what they needed most, a sense of control over the situation and hope for salvation. To further ground this story, allow me to share one striking everyday detail that better than any description reveals the sheer reality and materiality of this fear. Archaeologists, excavating old cemeteries in Poland, the Czech Republic, and other Slavic countries regularly unearth so-called vampire burials. And one of their most telling features is a sickle placed over the deceased's neck. The logic behind this gruesome ritual was starkly pragmatic. If the dead person attempted to rise from the grave, the sharp blade of the sickle would inevitably sever their head. Think about that for a moment. People weren't merely afraid. They were taking preventative action. They were turning the grave into a trap. This isn't just superstition. It's a safety technology integrated into the very burial rite. They were burying their loved ones, perhaps cherished people, and simultaneously taking measures to ensure those same loved ones couldn't return to harm them. In this simple, horrifying fact lies the entire essence of the human factor in the history of vampirism. This isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about people who lived in a world full of real dangers and inexplicable threats, and tried to protect themselves with the means available to them. It's a story about what a person is willing to do to protect their family and their world from chaos, even if it means peering into a grave and driving a stake into the heart of someone they once knew and perhaps loved. For centuries, the finely tuned mechanism of the trial of the dead operated flawlessly. It was localized, swift, and effective. It diagnosed the problem, identified the culprit, and destroyed them, restoring calm to the community. This system was perfect in its self-contained nature. It required no external interference and gave people complete confidence in their own abilities. But in the year 1732, this ideal self-sufficient system encountered an unforeseen challenge that it was simply incapable of processing. This challenge did not emerge from a grave. It arrived from Vienna in the form of an imperial military medical commission. The perfect storm began the moment a carriage carrying Austrian officers and doctors rolled into the Serbian village of Medveja. For the peasants, this was an event from another world. On one side stood people armed with centuries of knowledge, aspen stakes, and faith. On the other, individuals in powdered wigs, with satchels full of surgical instruments and with empty notebooks ready to record, analyze, and question. It was a clash of two universes, the world of ritual and the world of protocol. The peasants knew what needed to be done, but now they were forbidden to do it without the sanction of outsiders who understood neither their language nor their fears. Here is where the dialectic of strength and weakness became apparent. The very simplicity and unshakable certainty that was the main strength of the peasant ritual became its fatal vulnerability. When the commission, led by Johann Fluckinger, began the exhumations, they observed all the same things the peasants had before them: undecayed bodies, blood, distended bellies. But they viewed these phenomena through different eyes. For a peasant, this was undeniable proof of guilt. For an Austrian doctor, it was merely a set of perplexing but likely natural symptoms that demanded cool-headed description, not immediate incineration. The process was paralyzed. The peasants demanded immediate impalement to end the suffering of the living. The doctors demanded delay to measure, weigh, and officially document everything. The aspen stake confronted the scalpel, and the scalpel triumphed. Faith clashed with bureaucracy. Instead of the swift, cleansing fire of ritual, a slow, agonizing dissection began, which brought no relief, only magnified horror and bewilderment. The system broke down because its primary instrument, absolute collective belief, had been called into question. But the most unexpected turn was something else entirely. The goal of the ritual was not just to destroy the vampire, but to bury the story itself along with it, to localize the fear within the confines of a single village. The commission, however, did the exact opposite. Their famous report, Visum et Repertum, Latin for seen and discovered, became an informational bombshell. Written in dry, almost scientific language, it meticulously described the opened graves and the vampiric signs. This document was sent to Vienna, and from there copies spread throughout Europe. The vampire of Medveja made its way onto the pages of London, Paris, and Berlin newspapers. From a localized superstition, it transformed into a European sensation. Instead of dispelling the myth, the authorities' rational approach lent it weight and legitimacy. Now, vampires were discussed not only by frightened peasants, but also by scholars in academies, aristocrats in salons, and common folk in coffee houses. The attempt of enlightened reason to study and classify the darkness merely amplified and spread it exponentially. The genie had been let out of the bottle, and that bottle had been sealed with an imperial stamp. And so, an ancient defense mechanism, centuries honed, shattered. It drew its power from seclusion, yet public scrutiny utterly dismantled it. Its power was rooted in unwavering belief, yet doubt rendered it utterly impotent. The old order, steeped in ritual, found itself utterly defenseless against the burgeoning new world of newspapers and official reports. And then it arrived, The paramount question that hung heavy in the air across all of enlightened Europe as Flückinger's report landed on the desks of officials and editors. The ancient rite was defunct, yet the monster it had contained sprang to terrifying, vibrant life, transforming from a village nightmare into a continent-wide crisis. What then was to be done with this monstrous entity they themselves had unwittingly unleashed? It would be an oversimplification and intellectually disingenuous to dismiss the entire vampire hysteria as mere fear of disease. Today, historians propose at least two alternative, more cynical theories that reveal the often earthly, human motives lurking behind supernatural terror. The first theory posits that accusations of vampirism served as a potent instrument of social control. Whom did they most often suspect? Reclusive elders, strangers who had settled in the village, women practicing herbal medicine, or simply those deemed eccentric. Labeling a deceased person a vampire was a retroactive means of punishing them for violating the unwritten rules of the community, while simultaneously serving as a stark warning to the living. Conform, or even death will not grant you peace. A second, even more pragmatic theory points to an underlying economic motive. Picture this situation. In a poor peasant community where every scrap of land counted, a solitary yet prosperous landowner dies, or an entire family perishes from illness. Who inherits their land and property? Accusing the deceased of vampirism was the perfect way to utterly discredit the entire family, erasing their good name. After the ritualistic destruction of the vampire, their heirs became outcasts, and their property could easily be redistributed among more pious neighbors. The monster in the grave served as an excellent smokescreen for a blatant redistribution of wealth. Yet, even when we discard notions of malice, the economics of vampirism were brutal and inexorable. Let's translate this into tangible numbers. The tax the Austrian emperor levied on a peasant was palpable yet predictable. It claimed a portion of grain or a handful of coins. But the tax levied by a vampire was absolute. It didn't claim the harvest, it claimed the laborer. In a peasant family where survival hinged on the number of working hands, the death of an adult man or woman was an economic catastrophe tantamount to utter ruin. A tuberculosis epidemic sweeping through a family, misunderstood as a vampire's curse, surpassed any fire or raid in its destructive economic power. The loss of one cow was a tragedy. Saving for a replacement would take years. The loss of a breadwinner meant starvation for the entire family come winter. Thus, the fight against the vampire was not merely a struggle against evil, it was a desperate battle for economic survival, an attempt to halt an invisible creditor who demanded the most terrible payment of all, human life itself. And in this light, many rituals take on hidden meanings. Take, for instance, the burning of a vampire's heart and the mixing of its ashes with water, given to the sick to drink, as in the famous case of Mercy Brown in America. This wasn't merely a wild superstition. It was a symbolic act, a social manifesto. The heart was believed to be the seat of life and personality. By burning it, the community wasn't just killing a monster. It was symbolically annihilating the very essence of the contagion, its source. It was a public ritual of purification, intended to break the chain of deaths and demonstrate to all that order had been restored. Thus, the history of vampirism is not solely a history of fear. It is also a history of power, money, and symbols. Behind the figure of the nocturnal bloodsucker lurked very real social conflicts, economic struggles, and a deep human need for rituals that could restore a sense of control over their destiny. The monster in the grave was merely a convenient scapegoat, onto whom all misfortunes, from epidemics to their own greed, could be heaped. And now, having traced the paths of official reports, inhaled the putrid air of a terrified village, meticulously dismantled the gruesome machinery of the dead man's trial, and even peered into its cynical economic underpinnings, the picture begins to clarify. We stand atop a mountain of facts, rumors, and tragedies, and from this vantage point, we can finally survey the entire landscape. The time has come to weave together all the threads of our investigation and answer the paramount question: what is the true key to this astonishing phenomenon? Why did the belief in vampires prove to be so incredibly potent? The solution, as is often the case, lies not in complexity, but in astonishing multifacetedness. A vampire is not merely a monster. It is not merely a folklore character. The phenomenon of vampirism is a brilliant, albeit unconscious, invention of the human collective mind. It is a universal answer to a whole complex of intractable problems. First, the vampire serves as a pre-scientific medical diagnosis. When people faced an invisible killer that decimated entire families, what we today call tuberculosis, sepsis, or plague, they needed to give the enemy a name and a face. The vampire became that face. It perfectly explained the symptoms: weakness, pallor, and wasting away. It provided a simple and understandable explanation for why the illness spread within a single family. The deceased returned to their own. Second, the vampire is a tool of social justice. In the confined, insular world of the village, where everything was out in the open, any deviation from the norm, be it wealth, antisocial behavior, alleged witchcraft, or simply foreign origin, provoked suspicion and tension. An accusation of vampirism was a way to posthumously punish a non-conforming member of society, restore social justice, and teach a lesson to the living. It was a mechanism that allowed the community to purge accumulated negativity, unite in the face of a common threat, and redistribute resources in its favor. Third, the vampire is a legal precedent for a world where there were no advocates for the dead. As we've seen, the ritual of exhumation was not a chaotic mob lynching, but a quasi-judicial process with its own evidence, witnesses, and verdict. This process gave people the illusion of control over death and chaos. It transformed the passive suffering of epidemic victims into the active participation of justice wielders. By destroying the vampire's body, people weren't just fighting disease. They were symbolically conquering death itself, proving to themselves that even it submitted to their rules and their judgment. So, what is the ultimate key to the vampire phenomenon? Its genius lay not in fangs or a thirst for blood. Its genius lay in its sheer universality. The vampire is the perfect container for fear. Into this mythological vessel, absolutely any terror could be poured. Fear of an epidemic, fear of a neighbor, fear of divine retribution, fear of starvation, fear of sin. It was the ideal scapegoat onto which all the world's troubles could be blamed. It was simultaneously a medical, social, legal, and religious phenomenon. This incredible adaptability is precisely the reason for its immortality. It could be a decaying corpse in a Serbian village because people feared decomposition and disease. It could become a sophisticated aristocrat in Victorian London because people feared the degeneration of old elites and sexual temptations. Today, it can be an energy vampire because we fear psychological burnout and toxic relationships. The vampire doesn't die, it simply mutates, reflecting the primary fears of each specific era. And when you realize this, the history of vampirism ceases to be merely a collection of scary stories. It is no longer folklore or superstition. It is a design of titanic, almost biological scope. It is the story of how humanity, over thousands of years, created and perfected the ideal cultural virus, an idea capable of surviving in any conditions, adapting to any environment, and infecting the consciousness of new generations time and time again. In this sense, the vampire is the most perfect monster we have ever created, because when we gaze into it, we are not actually seeing a monster, we are seeing a mirror, and in its dark surface, polished by centuries, all our most hidden and unchanging fears are reflected. It would seem that with the advent of modern medicine and forensic science, the vampire should have finally died, becoming a dusty museum exhibit. But the opposite occurred. Its legacy proved so powerful that, like a domino effect, it generated an entire chain of consequences that have reached into our modern day and become interwoven into the very fabric of our culture, often in the most unexpected places. The first and most crucial chain of consequences is legal and medical. That very vampire panic of the 18th century paradoxically spurred the development of forensic medicine. When reports like the visum et repertum reached Vienna and other European capitals, scientists and physicians were compelled to seek rational explanations for the gruesome phenomena described by the military. It was then that the first serious studies of post-mortem decomposition processes began. Doctors started to investigate how a corpse changes under different conditions, what lividity is, why bloating occurs, and what catalepsy is, a state where a person appears dead but is, in fact, alive. Thus, in attempting to disprove the existence of vampires, science took a giant leap forward in understanding death, ultimately leading to the creation of modern protocols for declaring death and conducting autopsies. So, what then is the ultimate key to the vampire phenomenon? Its genius lay not in fangs or a thirst for blood. Its genius was its sheer universality. The vampire is the perfect container for fear. Into this mythological vessel, absolutely any terror could be poured. Fear of an epidemic, fear of a neighbor, fear of divine retribution, fear of starvation, fear of sin. It was the ideal scapegoat onto which all the world's troubles could be heaped. It was simultaneously a medical, social, legal, and religious phenomenon. This incredible adaptability is precisely the reason for its immortality. It could be a decaying corpse in a Serbian village because people feared decomposition and disease. It could become a sophisticated aristocrat in Victorian London because people feared the degeneration of old elites and sexual temptations. Today, it can be an energy vampire because we fear psychological burnout and toxic relationships. The vampire doesn't die. It simply mutates, reflecting the primary fears of each specific era. And when you realize this, the history of vampirism ceases to be merely a collection of scary stories. It is no longer folklore or superstition. It is a design of titanic, almost biological scope. It is the story of how humanity, over thousands of years, created and perfected the ideal cultural virus. An idea capable of surviving in any conditions, adapting to any environment, and infecting the consciousness of new generations time and time again. In this sense, the vampire is the most perfect monster we have ever created, because when we gaze into it, we are not actually seeing a monster. We are seeing a mirror, and in its dark surface, polished by centuries, all our most hidden and unchanging fears are reflected. It would seem that with the advent of modern medicine and forensic science, the vampire should have finally died, becoming a dusty museum exhibit. But the opposite occurred. Its legacy proved so powerful that, like a domino effect, it generated an entire chain of consequences that have reached into our modern day and become interwoven into the very fabric of our culture, often in the most unexpected places. The first and most crucial chain of consequences is legal and medical. That very vampire panic of the 18th century, paradoxically, spurred the development of forensic medicine. When reports like the visum et repertum reached Vienna and other European capitals, scientists and physicians were compelled to seek rational explanations for the gruesome phenomena described by the military. It was then that the first serious studies of post-mortem decomposition processes began. Doctors started to investigate how a corpse changes under different conditions, what lividity is, why bloating occurs, and what catalepsy is, a state where a person appears dead but is, in fact, alive. Thus, in attempting to disprove the existence of vampires, science took a giant leap forward in understanding death, ultimately leading to the creation of modern protocols for declaring death and conducting autopsies. And so, the most grotesque creature of European folklore transformed into global culture's most alluring anti-hero. The vampire's legacy proved paradoxical. The less people believed in it as a tangible threat, the more potent it became as a cultural icon. It lost the battle against science in the physical world, yet it triumphed in the war for our collective imagination, a victory far more enduring. It might seem there's an unbridgeable chasm of technology, knowledge and progress separating us from an 18th century Serbian peasant. But let a global crisis strike, and that chasm vanishes in an instant. Consider recent events. When a new, baffling epidemic swept across the globe, what did we witness? The very same phenomena observed 300 years ago in the village of Medveja. We saw fear, panic, a desperate hunt for the patient zero, and the spread of rumors that flew faster than the virus itself. We watched as people, consumed by terror, began to embrace the wildest conspiracy theories and cast suspicion on official science. Only the stage props have changed. Instead of whispers passed from house to house, we now have social media, where any falsehood can instantly assume the guise of irrefutable truth. Instead of reports ferried by postal coaches, we have viral posts and videos. But the underlying mechanism remains the same. When confronted with an invisible, impersonal, and terrifying threat, the human mind instinctively searches for a culprit. It craves an enemy with a face, a malevolent intent, a simple and comprehensible narrative to explain the chaos. And this brings us to the pivotal, non-obvious lesson this centuries-old saga imparts. It's not about the vampires, it's about us. The paramount lesson of vampirism's history is this: our minds abhor the vacuum of uncertainty and complexity, and they are eager to fill that void with any explanation, no matter how absurd, as long as it's simple and intelligible. It's easier for us to believe in an evil revenant than to reconcile ourselves with a world brimming with random, meaningless tragedies. We create monsters because monsters can be fought. They can be located, identified, and vanquished. You cannot drive a wooden stake through the heart of a tuberculosis bacterium. You cannot burn an economic crisis or social injustice at the stake. But you can find a scapegoat, a foreigner, a witch, a Jew, a vampire, an agent of influence, and unleash all your fear and fury upon them. Monster creation is a defense mechanism of our psyche, offering us the illusion of control in a world where we actually possess very little. This mechanism operates flawlessly even today. We continue to conjure our own vampires, simply calling them by different names. We demonize political opponents, transforming them into absolute evil. We seek external enemies onto whom we can project all our internal failings. We label entire social groups, attributing sinister designs to them. The technology of monster manufacturing hasn't disappeared. It has merely become more sophisticated. And so, here is the preliminary conclusion of our inquiry, our guiding principle for the 21st century. The vampire's narrative serves as a profound admonition. It tells us that the most perilous epidemic isn't a virus afflicting the body, but rather fear infecting the mind. It teaches us that in any bewildering situation, before seeking an enemy outside ourselves, it's wise to look within and ask, am I, right now, attempting to conjure yet another monster simply to avoid confronting the real, complex, and terrifying truth? Until now, we've viewed this narrative through the eyes of the living, frightened, suffering, yet ultimately justified in their struggle. But now let's attempt something intellectually audacious. Let's endeavor to gaze upon this drama from a different vantage point. Let's strive to comprehend the very logic of the enemy. Of course, a decaying corpse possesses no intricate civilization, yet it possesses its own truth, monstrous though it may be. Let's deconstruct the image of the soulless monster and consider it as a tragic figure, a victim of insurmountable circumstances, the primary and chief casualty in this story. It isn't evil, it is broken. Imagine this state of being. Consciousness, if it exists at all, is imprisoned within a cold, inert body, buried beneath layers of earth. There is no time, no light, no sound, only an eternal, gnawing cold and one solitary, all-consuming sensation: hunger. Not merely a hunger of the stomach. This is a total, metaphysical thirst, a craving for warmth, for movement, for life itself. And then, through this sepulchral silence, a call begins to pierce. The warmth of the blood of those it once held dear, their breath, their vital energy, all of it acts as an irresistible beacon in the icy darkness. Movement from the grave is not an act of malice, it is an instinct, as powerful and uncontrollable as that of a salmon swimming upstream to spawn, driven to its own demise. In this mirrored reflection, the world of the living appears utterly different. Daylight, which for us is a symbol of life and joy, is for it physical agony, a fire scorching its dead flesh. The home it left behind is not a place for sentimental memories, but the epicenter of that very warmth, that vital force which drives it to madness. The people it once loved are now perceived not as individuals, but as mere vessels, brimming with what it vitally requires. It reaches for them not out of hatred, but from a monstrous, distorted form of love, a desperate need to be near the source of life, even if that proximity means its own annihilation. And how wild and incomprehensible must the world of the living have seemed to it. Imagine the cultural shock this creature endures. People who just yesterday mourned it at its grave now arrive with shovels to unearth it. They drag it, inert and defenseless in the light of day, to the surface. Their faces are contorted not by grief, but by horror and loathing. They shriek words in an incomprehensible language of prayers, thrusting metallic objects and pieces of wood at it. For it, this is no act of justice. It is an act of unprovoked, transcendent cruelty. Yesterday's loved ones have transformed into merciless executioners. And here we approach the tragedy of its predictability. Why did the vampire, despite being supernaturally powerful, almost invariably lose? Because all its strength was rooted in instinct, in tradition. It was a slave to its hunger and its nature. It always returned home. It always hunted its loved ones. It always retreated to its grave with the first rays of the sun. Its behavior was entirely predictable. Its very power, that indomitable craving, became its ultimate vulnerability. The living, conversely, were unpredictable. Their fear compelled them to think, to innovate, to forge an entirely new mode of warfare. They could not defeat it by brute force, so they vanquished it with knowledge of its habits. They devised a counter-protocol based on its very weaknesses. They knew where to seek it by day. They knew how to safeguard their homes by night. They pinpointed its Achilles heel, be it a wooden stake, garlic, or the light of the sun. Thus, the powerful adversary proved unprepared for an entirely new type of thinking, born of desperation. Its age-old traditions, its unyielding modus operandi, its primitive yet potent instinctual logic, all became its death sentence. It lost not because it was weaker, but because it couldn't adapt, while humans, pushed to their limits, were forced to become smarter, more cunning, and ultimately more merciless than the monster itself. The brilliance of the trial of the dead system lay in its simplicity and effectiveness. But this brilliance came at a terrible price, and the heaviest moral compromise rested on the shoulders of the person who authorized its initiation, the village elder or the priest. Imagine that choice. On one hand, the sacred, inviolable law of ancestors and God: do not disturb the peace of the deceased. This was the very foundation of their world order. On the other, the cries of mothers whose children were fading before their eyes, and the silent terror in the eyes of the entire village. To save the living, one had to commit the gravest sin against the dead. One had to desecrate a grave, to drive a stake through the heart of someone you yourself might have baptized or married. This decision was not merely difficult, it was monstrous, and everyone who made it crossed a line forever, burning a piece of their own soul. Let's delve into the inner world of this individual, this nameless crisis manager. Initially, he is an idealist. He genuinely believes this is a singular, exceptional case, a terrible but necessary sacrifice for the salvation of his flock. He prays through the nights, begging God for forgiveness for what he is about to do. The burden of responsibility weighs on him unbearably. He feels isolated in the face of this choice. But then the ritual is performed, and, miracle of miracles, the panic in the village subsides, the deaths cease. The system worked. He receives confirmation of his righteousness and feels immense relief. But when the epidemic returns a year or two later, everything changes. Now, he is no longer an idealist. He is a pragmatist who possesses a proven, working tool. His hesitation diminishes, his resolve hardens. He begins to see potential vampires even during their lifetimes, noting their reclusiveness, their eccentricities, and improper death. The constant tension and fear of a repeat catastrophe make him tougher, more suspicious. From a shepherd protecting his sheep, he gradually transforms into a surgeon who unhesitatingly amputates the infected part of the community to save the whole. He becomes the tyrant of this posthumous justice, the sole decider of whose grave will be opened next. And upon the altar of this success, upon the altar of public tranquility, sacrifices were inevitably made. And not always were these genuine monsters. Let's recount the story of one such victim, an old widow who lived on the outskirts. She was reclusive, knew about herbs, and treated livestock with incantations. She was both feared and respected. She died peacefully, a natural death. A week later, dysentery broke out in the village, and 2 children died. The logic of the frightened mob was simple and merciless. The connection was obvious. The elder, perhaps, harbored doubts deep in his heart. He had known this woman his entire life, but panic was escalating. He needed a scapegoat, a swift and effective way to quell the hysteria. And he made his choice. He sacrificed the memory of this woman for the tranquility of the living. Her grave was opened. Of course, signs were found. The body in the damp earth had decomposed poorly. The verdict was pronounced and executed. The community calmed, feeling the cause had been eliminated. And the old widow, who might have simply been a lonely and misunderstood soul, was betrayed and erased from history, becoming yet another trophy in the war against fear. The cost of this social mechanism's brilliance was its excessive effectiveness. It offered too simple a solution for overly complex problems. It allowed for medical investigation to be replaced by a posthumous lynching. It provided an outlet for collective hatred and enabled old scores to be settled. It was the perfect weapon in the hands of fear. And therein lies its primary dark side. The system created to protect against monsters began to produce them itself. It granted the mob, driven by superstitious terror, the right to administer its own justice, which allowed for neither appeal nor acquittal. The line between community protection and witch hunt, between justice and barbarism, became imperceptibly thin. And the illusion of order and control demanded real, albeit posthumous, human sacrifices. When the pragmatic, bureaucratic world of the Austrian Empire clashed with the ancient, ritualistic world of the Balkan village, it was no peaceful exchange of cultural values. It was a turbulent chemical reaction. Imagine mixing 2 unstable reagents. On one side, centuries of concentrated fear founded on absolute belief. On the other, a cold, corrosive solution of rationalism and skepticism. The result was not a synthesis, but an explosion that initially annihilated both original cultures of fear and then, from the ashes, birthed something utterly new and unimaginably potent. Initially, it was a brutal conflict on every conceivable level. In the realm of faith, the authority of the village priest, who knew with absolute certainty that an aspen stake would do the trick, clashed fiercely with that of scholarly theologians like Augustin Calmet, who demanded not belief but concrete evidence and scripture citations. The simple, time-honored ritual was paralyzed by a novel, intricate discourse. In language, local, homegrown names such as Vordelak, Upir, or Strigoi were superseded by a single, international, and somewhat unsettlingly scientific term, vampire, which propagated rapidly through newspapers. The monster was no longer ours, it became everyone's. Yet from this very conflict, astonishing and peculiar hybrids began to emerge. The scientific vampire was the first of these fascinating crossbreeds. This was not yet the cape-swathed aristocrat, but no longer merely a rotting corpse. It was an object of study, the Arnold Powell case, meticulously dissected in reports and academic papers. This was a creature whose existence was debated in academies, its habits meticulously catalogued. This hybrid was born from the unlikely union of superstition and scientific protocol, of primal fear and the cold gaze of the microscope. It was simultaneously real and impossible, a paradox that made it all the more terrifying to the enlightened public. Then came the birth of the greatest and most influential hybrid, a cultural mutant that would sweep the globe. This was the literary vampire. It emerged when the Eastern European folkloric dread of physical decay was placed within the crucible of Western European romanticism, with its cult of personality, tragic love, and world-weary melancholy. Count Dracula himself represents the very Greco-Buddhism of the vampiric realm. In his veins, the blood of the Balkan Upir mingled with that of the English Lord Byron. He inherited an ancient curse and an unquenchable thirst for blood from his rustic ancestor, but gained manners, intellect, vast wealth, and tragic depth from his literary creator. And this cultural explosion utterly transformed the everyday experience of fear. For a peasant in a Serbian village, a vampire was a real, foul, reeking problem that required collective action, tackled with a shovel and a stake. The old custom was an active, communal undertaking. For a city dweller in London or Paris, the vampire became a form of entertainment, a pleasurable shiver experienced while curled up with a new Gothic novel in a cozy armchair. The old custom vanished, replaced by a new reality. Fear had become a commodity. It could be purchased at any bookshop. Thus, the great melting pot obliterated the primal, authentic fear rooted in personal experience and ritual. It transformed it from a matter of survival into a matter of leisure. But in its place, it spawned an immortal monster of ideas, infinitely more complex, captivating, and perilous than any village corpse. This new hybrid vampire no longer threatened the body. Instead, it aimed directly for the soul of Western civilization, targeting its hidden anxieties and secret desires. We are accustomed to believing that propaganda and information warfare are inventions of the 20th century. But this is far from the truth. The history of vampirism, or more precisely, the true story of Vlad the Impaler, stands as a brilliant testament to the ruthless battle for minds waged in the 15th century, where the weapons were not merely swords, but also rumors, pamphlets, and deliberately crafted myths. And Vlad himself was a master of this game. He penned no treatises. His propaganda was far more visceral. He meticulously constructed his public image, that of absolute, unyielding, and inhuman justice. His most notorious media project was the infamous Forest of Stakes. When the army of Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia, Vlad didn't merely fight. He orchestrated a grand, monstrous performance. Thousands of captured Turks were impaled on stakes along the road leading to the capital. This wasn't simply a mass execution. It was a message etched onto the bodies of his enemies, a message that proclaimed, "Here your empire ends. Here begins Dracula's land, where the laws of humanity hold no sway." He wasn't trying to appear benevolent. He was forging a brand based on supernatural terror. He deliberately transformed himself from a mere prince into a living legend, a demonic force best left undisturbed. But for every act of propaganda, there's always a counter-propaganda. Vlad's primary adversaries in this information war weren't so much the Turks as they were the Saxon merchants from Transylvania. Vlad's protectionist laws had severely impacted their incomes, and they loathed him fiercely. And in their hands lay a new, unprecedentedly powerful weapon, the printing press. It was they who launched one of history's first black propaganda campaigns. They took genuine accounts of Vlad's cruelty and amplified them to cosmic, demonic proportions. In German towns, inexpensive pamphlets featuring engravings depicting Dracula's monstrous atrocities began to circulate. These told tales of him feasting among impaled corpses, of boiling people in cauldrons, of forcing mothers to consume their own roasted children. These pamphlets became the best sellers of their era. They forged an image not merely of a cruel ruler, but of a sadist, a maniac, and fiend from the depths of hell. And it was in these very texts that the motif directly linking Sepesh to vampirism first appeared. They claimed that Dracula dipped his bread into a bowl of his victim's blood. Thus, thanks to enemy propaganda, the historical prince began his transformation into a bloodsucker long before Bram Stoker ever put pen to paper. And here we have a classic example of how history is written by the victors, or in this case, by those with access to the media. Consider the famous episode of the extermination of the boyars. In the pamphlets, this event is depicted as an act of pure madness. Dracula supposedly summons hundreds of boyars to a feast, poses a treacherous question about how many princes they have outlasted, and upon receiving their answer, orders them all impaled so that no one else would interfere with his rule. In this version, Vlad is a deranged tyrant, killing for sport. However, viewing this event through the lens of Romanian sources and political logic reveals a drastically different picture. The victors, the Saxons, omitted the crucial truth. Walachia's boyar elite was the primary destabilizing force in the country. They were the oligarchs of their time, constantly weaving conspiracies, overthrowing and assassinating rulers they disliked. They were, in fact, responsible for the treacherous murder of Vlad's own father and elder brother. Thus, his action was not a fit of madness, but a brutal, yet entirely rational political purge. It was a covert operation to eliminate a fifth column that was intended to consolidate his power and stabilize the state in the face of the Ottoman threat. The cruelty was real, but the motive was not sadistic. It was political. Yet this dry, factual version, of course, lost out to the thrilling narrative of a banquet with the dead. And so, black propaganda triumphed over historical truth. The original concept behind the vampire hunt, while horrific, was fundamentally one of defense. It was a sacred compact between the living and the dead, an extreme measure taken in response to a real mortal threat. The means, grave desecration, a stake through the heart, fire, were monstrous, but the objective, saving the community, justified them in the eyes of the people. Yet at some point, an imperceptible but fatal shift occurred. The question ceased to be, which of the dead is killing us? It became, which of the dead is bothering us? At that precise moment, the end no longer justified the means. The means themselves became the end. The vampire hunt, from a desperate act of protection, transformed into a perfect instrument for settling scores, redistributing property, and eliminating undesirables. This was the second, definitive point of no return. This internal schism can best be illustrated through the conflict between two archetypes, two former kindred spirits. On one side stood the old village priest. For him, the ritual of exhumation was a terrible sin and a profound spiritual trauma, something he undertook only in the direst circumstances, with prayer and trepidation. He was the guardian of a sacred dread, remembering that this was a dialogue with forces beyond human comprehension. On the other side was the young, pragmatic, and ambitious village elder. He had witnessed how this mechanism worked. He understood that an accusation of vampirism was an ultimate weapon, one that not only quelled panic, but also allowed him to eliminate any problem in the village with impunity. For him, it wasn't a sacrament. It was a technology of power. And so, one day, a wealthy but universally disliked miller died in the village, leaving behind fertile land and a young widow. Soon after the burial, someone's child fell ill. The elder immediately declared that it was the work of the deceased miller. He saw a perfect opportunity to appease the frightened parents, to get rid of an inconvenient family, and to divide the newly available land. He demanded the priest's sanction for an exhumation. But the priest, observing the child's symptoms, recognized a common fever, not a vampire's blight. He saw no omens, felt none of the icy grip of true evil. He refused to give his blessing, stating there was no reason to disturb the deceased's rest. It was then that the elder committed the symbolic act that marked the final rupture. He betrayed the very essence of the idea, turning it against its custodian. He publicly accused the priest of conspiring with dark forces, of covering for the vampire out of greed or cowardice. Gathering the darkest and most avaricious men, he bypassed the authority of the church and led them to the graveyard. This was no longer a ritualistic procession, it was a punitive expedition. Prayers were replaced by drunken shouts, and sacred fear by the anticipation of ill-gotten gains. They unearthed the miller's grave. The exhumation process itself devolved into a farce. They didn't search for signs, they assigned them. Any stain on the shroud, any hint of bloating, everything became irrefutable evidence. The priest, attempting to stop them, was pushed aside and humiliated. They plunged the stake into the body, not with reverence, but with ferocity, as if punishing it for its wealth and unlikable nature. This was no longer a fight against a monster. It was a lynch mob's justice delivered upon a corpse. This act signaled the end of an era. The elder got what he wanted. The miller's widow was banished, his land divided among those who participated in the brutal deed, and the frightened parents of the sick child were appeased. But the cost of this victory was immense. The sacred weapon, forged over centuries to battle chaos, had been broken and turned into a crude bludgeon for resolving petty domestic disputes. The system designed to protect against monsters had itself become a monster. It revealed that the most terrifying vampire is not one that rises from the grave, but one that resides within the human soul. Its greed, its envy, and its willingness to exploit the fear of others to achieve its own ends. The ancient ritual died that night because the faith had drained from it. All that remained was an empty, cruel form, stripped of any sacred meaning. When the dust settled and the ashes of the burned vampire scattered to the wind, a hush fell. But this was not the quietude of healing. It was the silence of a morgue. A society that had endured such an upheaval could never return to its former state. And in this new, disfigured world, there were clear winners and losers. The losers were not only the families of the accused, erased from life and memory. The old social structure itself, based on age-old traditions and the authority of the church, also lost. The victors, however, were not heroes or the righteous. The victors were the cynics. The new elite, rising on a wave of fear, were precisely those pragmatic village elders who had realized that fear was the most valuable and convertible resource. This new elite possessed neither the lineage of the old boyars nor the spiritual authority of the priests. Their power rested on one thing, a monopoly on the interpretation of threat. They became specialists in fear, crisis managers who knew how to initiate and how to halt the machinery of the dead hunt. They decided whose oddity was merely eccentricity and whose was a sign of future vampirism. They determined whose death was proper and whose was suspicious. In their hands, an accusation of vampirism became not just a weapon, but a tool of political control, allowing them to keep the entire community in a state of constant, low-level tension and dependence on their expertise. And the economy of this new world was forged from the very bones of its inhabitants. Each successful hunt ushered in a minute reallocation of assets. The house, the livestock, the land, and the meager possessions of the vampire and their banished family were redistributed among the living. This created a terrifyingly potent economic incentive. Vampire hunting ceased to be merely a defensive measure. It became a shadowy economic sector, a brutal lottery where one could dramatically improve their financial standing at the expense of a deceased neighbor. In villages where life was punishingly poor, the temptation proved too great. Thus, the fear of supernatural evil spawned a very real economic evil. But the most profound changes occurred within the psychology of the survivors. This wasn't the euphoria of conquerors. It was a deep, yet suppressed, collective trauma. People who had participated in the desecration of a grave, who had driven a stake into the body of yesterday's neighbor, couldn't simply return to their ordinary lives. To justify their actions, to keep their sanity in the face of their deeds, they needed to further cement their belief in the monstrosity of the enemy they had vanquished. The more barbaric their act, the more demonic the vampire had to be. This created a vicious circle. Cruelty begot belief, and belief justified new cruelty. The human worldview was irrevocably altered. The ancient order, life, death, peaceful rest, had crumbled. Now, death was no longer an end, but the potential genesis of a new war. Every funeral became a wellspring of anxiety, every illness a breeding ground for suspicion. The bonds between neighbors were poisoned by mistrust. Who among them would be next? And who would wield the shovel at your very grave? The community, once cemented by kinship and shared faith, was now bound by collective fear and shared complicity. Ultimately, the society that emerged from the vampire hysteria became more insular, paranoid, and brutal. It survived, but at the cost of its very soul. It learned to fight monsters, but in the crucible of that battle, it absorbed their darkest attributes. It didn't conquer the darkness. It merely learned to harness it for its own ends. And this was the most terrifying consequence. The true horror wasn't that the dead rose from their graves, but that the living, in battling them, shed their very humanity. Beneath all that blood, fear, and shattered bone lay more than mere hysteria. Beneath it, a powerful, coherent, and in its own grim way, a perfectly structured philosophical system. The governing tenet, the very lodestar, was the concept of cosmic order. To the pre-scientific mind, the cosmos wasn't a chaotic jumble of phenomena, but a living, fragile organism where every element was intricately interconnected. The realm of the living and the realm of the dead, the harvest in the fields and the phases of the moon, human health and the sanctity of one's grave, all were cogs in a single, vast mechanism. And this cosmic machinery demanded the most rigorous adherence to its rules, especially in a liminal state like death. An improper death was no mere personal tragedy. It was a catastrophic malfunction in the world's grand engine, inevitably triggering system-wide calamities, plagues, livestock blights, utter chaos. And thus, the vampire hunt transcended mere barbarism. It became a desperate, albeit brutal, attempt to locate and replace a damaged component to mend the very fabric of the cosmos. The intellectual engine of this system wasn't a particular philosopher. It was the collective, anonymous guardian of tradition, the village priest, elder, or healer. Their power lay not in innovation, but in memory. They didn't invent new ideas. They were a living archive, preserving the unwritten laws of their ancestors. They were the chief engineer of this cosmos, intimately familiar with how to conduct repairs. They knew that a stake had to be made of aspen, because legend held that Judas Iscariot hanged himself upon it, and the tree bore the curse of betrayal. They knew which prayers to recite to seal a grave. They were the grey cardinal of this world, their authority rooted not in force, but in sacred knowledge, in access to the universe's owner's manual. And so, this ancient, insular philosophical doctrine, founded on ritual and faith, collided with a young, aggressive, and incredibly self-assured alternative. Facing it was the philosophy of reason, the very child of the Enlightenment. Its adherents were not priests, but doctors and government officials. Their weapons were not prayers, but protocols. Their goal was not to restore order, but to comprehend the mechanism. This was a fundamental clash of ideas, unfolding directly at the edge of an excavated Serbian grave. The guardian of tradition, gazing at the undecomposed corpse, saw a sign. It was a message from another world, confirming the veracity of ancient laws. Their central question was, what does this mean? The doctor from the Imperial Commission, examining the same body, saw only a symptom. It was a biological phenomenon to be described, measured, and classified. Their central question was, how does it work? One sought to read the will of the gods, the other, the laws of nature. For one, the groan that escaped the corpse's chest when struck by a stake was the voice of a demon. For the other, it was merely the sound of escaping gases of decomposition. It was a collision of two incompatible universes. And in this battle of ideas, the doctrine of reason triumphed in the initial phase. Authorities prohibited the peasants' barbaric rituals. The doctor's report, written in Latin, held more sway in the eyes of the state than the guardian's centuries-old wisdom. Official science declared vampires a mere superstition. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Reason, in attempting to dissect and disprove the myth, only made it stronger. It dragged the village monster into the glaring light of European public discourse, transforming it from an object of faith into an object of curiosity. Thus, the philosophical battle of the 18th century led to a paradoxical outcome. The system founded on the idea of cosmic order was shattered, but the monster it had spawned and contained broke free. It ceased to be part of the sacred drama of creation and became part of secular culture. It was banished from theology, but triumphantly entered literature and later even science, psychiatry, anthropology, sociology. The philosophy that gave it birth died, but the monster itself found immortality, becoming an eternal subject for the study of human fear. The intellectual engine of this system wasn't a particular philosopher. Instead, it was the collective, anonymous guardian of tradition, the village priest, the elder, or the healer. Their power resided not in innovation, but in an encyclopedic memory. They didn't conjure new ideas, they were living archives, safeguarding the unwritten laws of their ancestors. They were the master engineers of this cosmos, intimately aware of precisely how to conduct repairs. They knew that a stake had to be fashioned from aspen, for folklore held that Judas Iscariot himself had hanged on such a tree, and it bore the indelible mark of betrayal's curse. They knew which ancient prayers to intone to seal a grave. They were the eminence grise of this world, their authority stemming not from brute force, but from sacred knowledge, from their exclusive access to the universe's owner's manual. And so, this ancient, self-contained philosophical doctrine, built on ritual and unwavering faith, collided head-on with a vibrant, aggressive, and astonishingly confident alternative. Opposing it was the philosophy of reason, the very progeny of the Enlightenment. Its champions were not priests, but medical doctors and government officials. Their weapons were not prayers, but meticulously documented protocols. Their objective was not to restore cosmic order, but to dissect and comprehend the underlying mechanism. This was a foundational clash of ideas, unfolding dramatically at the very edge of an excavated Serbian grave. The guardian of tradition, peering at the remarkably undecomposed corpse, saw a potent sign. It was a dire message from the beyond, affirming the ancient laws. Their paramount question was, what profound truth does this convey? The physician from the Imperial Commission, examining that exact same body, saw only a medical symptom. It was a biological phenomenon demanding precise description, measurement, and rigorous classification. Their paramount question was, how precisely does this operate? One strove to decipher the will of the gods, the other, the immutable laws of nature. For one, the chilling groan that escaped the deceased's chest when struck by a stake was the unmistakable voice of a demon. For the other, it was merely the audible release of gases from decomposition. This was the collision of two utterly incompatible worldviews. And in this intellectual skirmish, the doctrine of reason decisively triumphed in the initial round. Authorities swiftly outlawed the peasants' barbaric rituals. The physician's meticulously penned report, drafted in Latin, carried far more weight in the eyes of the state than the guardian's centuries-old accumulated wisdom. Official science unequivocally dismissed vampires as mere superstition. But this was a victory bought at a steep price, a true Pyrrhic triumph. Reason, in its fervent attempt to dissect and ultimately debunk the myth, inadvertently made it stronger. It yanked the localized village monster onto the dazzling stage of European public consciousness, transmuting it from an object of ancient faith into an irresistible object of modern curiosity. Thus, the philosophical struggle of the 18th century led to a truly paradoxical outcome. The intricate system built upon the idea of cosmic order was utterly demolished. Yet the very monster it had spawned and meticulously contained now broke free, unchained. It ceased to be an integral part of the sacred drama of creation, and instead became an enduring fixture of secular culture. Banished from the hallowed halls of theology, it made a triumphant, unstoppable entrance into literature, and subsequently into the burgeoning fields of science, psychiatry, anthropology, and sociology. The grand philosophy that had given it birth perished, but the monster itself achieved a new, terrifying form of immortality, forever serving as an object for humanity's endless fascination with its own primal fears. The grand system of vampire hunting reached its zenith when it gained official state recognition. The reports of military physicians and the imperial edicts of the Empress marked both its ultimate triumph and, paradoxically, its death knell. Born in an insular world of unquestioning faith, this system was never designed for external scrutiny. The moment it was dragged into the cold, unforgiving glare of enlightened reason, it began to decompose from within, an auto-cannibalistic decay. Rational doubt proved more terrifying than any malevolent entity. Rituals, stripped of universal, unquestioning belief, devolved from sacred rites into barbaric, grave desecrations. An aspen stake wielded by a skeptic was no longer a weapon of divine retribution, but merely a sharpened piece of wood. The system began to collapse under its own considerable weight, its core structural element, collective conviction, cracking and crumbling into dust. No external adversary was needed. But when the system finally expired, its vast, potent inheritance, the very image of the vampire, was left adrift, unclaimed. Immediately, a relentless battle for ownership erupted. The claimants, who tore this grand concept to shreds, were not individuals, but entire disciplines of human knowledge and art, each twisting it to their own advantage, distorting it beyond recognition. It was the grand dismemberment of a monster's corpse. First arrived the physicians and scientists, figures in crisp white gloves. They claimed the physical body as their own. They meticulously dissected it with the scalpel of pure logic, offering rational explanations for every supernatural sign. An undecomposed body, saponification, blood on the lips, the byproduct of putrefaction, groans from the coffin, the expulsion of decomposition gases. They transformed the vampire from a cursed revenant into a mere collection of medical curiosities, porphyria, catalepsy, tuberculosis. Their aim was to obliterate its essence by stripping away its mystique. In their hands, it became a sterile specimen in a jar of formalin, an object for dispassionate study rather than visceral dread. Next arrived the poets, artists, and romantic writers. They recoiled contemptuously from the decaying cadaver and claimed its immortal soul for their own. They cared not for the truth of fact, but for the truth of emotion. They transformed the hideous village ghoul into a tragic, Byronic aristocrat. They bestowed upon him a castle in the Carpathian Mountains, a velvet doublet, refined manners, and the profound, centuries-old sorrow in his gaze. Their vampire elicited not revulsion, but empathy and illicit fascination. He became an icon of rebellion against drab reality, the very embodiment of eternal youth and forbidden passion. Third, like opportunistic vultures, swooped in the publishers of penny dreadfuls and newspaper sensationalists. They had no use for either body or soul. They claimed the blood. Pure, unadulterated sensation. They discarded both scientific explanations and philosophical profundities, retaining only the screams, the fangs, and the most shocking details. They shrink-wrapped terror in a lurid cover, making it accessible, dirt-cheap, and mass-market. They transformed sacred dread into a consumable entertainment product, a mere sideshow attraction for the fairground. And while these grand inheritors carved up the empire somewhere in a remote, forgotten corner of Europe, perhaps in the late 19th century, the final bearer of the true idea quietly passed away. Picture an old peasant, still keenly remembering his grandfather's tales of true hunts. When an epidemic swept through his village and people began to perish, he was the sole one who understood what had to be done. He attempted to rally his neighbors to perform the ancient ritual, not from avarice, but from a profound primal fear and an unshakable sense of duty. But the world had irrevocably shifted. Standing in his path was not a demon, but a local constable with gleaming brass buttons. His attempt to open a grave was categorized not as a sacred rite, but as a felony, desecration of a burial site. This elder, likely deemed insane and arrested, was the last shard of that bygone era. His tragic and futile endeavor signaled the end of an entire age. The moment the ancient ritual of protection was definitively reclassified from the sacred to the criminal, the primal vampire, a child of faith and fear, perished once and for all. It left behind three powerful, yet utterly dissimilar, offspring: a tedious medical case study, a captivating literary hero, and a blood-soaked tabloid sensation. The battle for the inheritance had concluded. The original was lost forever. After the Enlightenment dealt its crushing blow, the authentic folkloric vampire entered a deep, almost century-long slumber. Its legacy wasn't merely forgotten, it was buried under a thick strata of rational explanations and official prohibitions. It transmuted into a shameful superstition, a ghost from a dark past, a topic considered impolite in respectable company. Much like an ancient pagan text scraped from parchment to make way for the life of a saint, the vampire myth was erased from cultural memory by a new, enlightened narrative. It survived only in the most remote hamlets, in whispered oral traditions, like a dying dialect understood by only a few elders. For the wider world, it was dead, its official obituary penned by the very reports that had once made it famous. And then, at the dawn of the 19th century, just when it seemed the monster was irrevocably gone, came the moment of its rediscovery. But it wasn't peasants or priests who resuscitated it. It was found and brought into the light by those who desperately sought an antidote to the cold, suffocating ennui of rationalism, the Romantic poets. Rebelling against the cult of reason, they yearned for passion, mystery, gothic horror, and exotic allure. And in yellowing old newspaper clippings and sensational pamphlets recounting vampire epidemics, they discovered the perfect material. In 1819, Lord Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, penned the short story The Vampire, and that was the decisive defibrillation, jolting the dead heart back into a beat. But this wasn't a resurrection. It was the birth of a new creature, forged from a monstrous yet brilliant misreading. The Romantics gazed upon the hideous, decaying corpse from a Serbian village and saw not what was, but what they yearned to see. They overlooked the grime, the stench, and the mindless instinct. Instead, they projected onto it their own ideals: tragic solitude, rebellion against society, eternal torment, and an aristocratic pallor. They mistakenly conflated monstrous hunger with profound spiritual anguish. It was the most magnificent misunderstanding in the history of monsters. This process of misreading reached its zenith at the close of the century in Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Stoker was a masterful synthesizer. He took the aristocratic template crafted by the Romantics, infused it with historical authenticity by borrowing the name from a real Wallachian prince, and placed it all within the context of his own Victorian era's anxieties. His Dracula was more than just a vampire. He was the quintessential embodiment of Victorian nightmares, a sexual menace to chaste Englishwomen, a foreign invader threatening the purity of British blood, and a decadent aristocrat symbolizing the twilight of the old world. The villagers' fear of a sickly neighbor was utterly displaced by the empire's dread of the outsider. But these transformations didn't stop there. In the 20th century, the vampire's legacy was rediscovered yet again, this time by psychoanalysts. New eras once more read the ancient myth through their own lens. Freud and his followers looked at Dracula and saw not a monster nor a hero, but a walking textbook of repressed desires. Fangs piercing the neck became for them a symbol of the forbidden sexual act. The coffin, an image of the maternal womb. The craving for blood, a manifestation of oral fixation. Thus, the vampire, having survived death at the hands of science and rebirth through the Romantics, found new life on the psychoanalyst's couch, morphing from humanity's foe into its most intriguing symptom. What we now refer to as the vampire myth, then, is in truth a layered confection of these successive misreadings. The original authentic monster is long dead. We are dealing not with its lingering echo, but with the echo of its distorted reflections. Each era fashioned its own vampire, imbuing it with its particular fears and hopes, and each new reading led us further and further from the gruesome, simple truth that once compelled people to grab spades and wooden stakes. We began our journey with a paradox. An enlightened, rational state in the 18th century dispatches a military medical commission to investigate an irrational, supernatural threat. Almost 300 years have passed, and the circle has come full turn. We live in an age that prides itself on its scientific rigor and access to information, yet we confront the very same problem repeatedly. Today, we no longer fear the dead rising from their graves, but we are paralyzed by terror at the thought of unseen viruses, economic collapses, information warfare, and conspiracy theories, all of which spread with monstrous velocity. And our reaction uncannily mirrors that of those very Serbian peasants. Confronted by an incomprehensible threat, we scramble desperately for simple answers and a specific culprit. We search for our own vampire, and we inevitably find it in the guise of political opponents, those with differing viewpoints, people from other cultures, or simply anyone who doesn't conform to our mold. We manufacture monsters out of them, hoping to simplify our complex and terrifying world, neatly dividing it into stark black and white. The mechanism remains chillingly consistent. Only the velocity of the contagion and the weaponry of the hunt have evolved. Instead of wooden stakes, we now wield cancel culture. Instead of whispered rumors, we have viral social media posts. Herein lies the central, unyielding paradox of this entire saga. For centuries, we battled the vampire. We attempted to kill it with science, dissect it with logic's scalpel, bury it under the crushing weight of facts. And we succeeded. We obliterated belief in the real, festering cadaver. But in doing so, we did not defeat the monster. We merely granted it true immortality. We liberated its essence from the fragile confines of superstition, unleashing it into the eternal realm of culture. The less we feared it as a physical threat, the more potent it became as a symbol, a metaphor, a mirror of our own passions and fears. Our very drive to destroy it rendered it invulnerable. We observe this cycle play out repeatedly. Each epoch births its own monsters, seeking to define itself through the very struggle against them. Every generation unearths its own vampires, upon whom to project the blame for its inherent woes and anxieties. We conjure them, battle them, vanquish them, only for them to resurrect in a new, even more refined guise, poised to challenge us once more. It is the grand, unending ballet between humanity and its own shadow. This very monster, which we have relentlessly pursued across centuries, ultimately reveals itself to be nothing less than our own reflection. It is the embodiment of all we fear and loathe within ourselves, our insatiable hunger, our raw cruelty, our relentless thirst for power, and our terrifying capacity to shed our humanity when confronted by fear. We need it so that by gazing upon it, we can declare, "This is not me. I am separate. I am human." And as we gaze upon this grand, bloody, tragic history, this endless cycle of creation and destruction, the ultimate final question surfaces, one for which there is no, and can be no, definitive answer. Is this ceaseless ballet with monsters an indispensable component of human nature, the very mechanism that enables us to delineate the boundaries of good and evil, light and shadow? Or is it a cursed, inescapable loop, where we are condemned to repeat the same errors repeatedly on a new turn of the spiral, perpetually discovering fresh adversaries outside ourselves, solely to avoid confronting the abyss that lurks within?